You are standing in the year 797 inside the great palace of Constantinople. The air is still, not peaceful, controlled. You hear the distant echo of footsteps moving through marble corridors, measured and unhurried. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city breathes, unaware of what is about to be decided in silence. You do not see a crowd. There will be none. This is not a public spectacle. This is an administrative moment. You wait. The lamps burn low. The sound of parchment being handled carries more weight than any weapon. Orders are being reviewed, not argued.
Decisions are being finalized, not questioned. You understand something instinctively now. Whatever happens next is meant to be endured, not witnessed. You are not here to die. Death would have been simpler than what the Empire has prepared for you. What follows was not born from anger or impulse. It was designed, refined, repeated. The Byzantine Empire did not rely on chaos to control powerful women. It relied on systems, on law, on ritual, on silence. This was an empire that believed stability was sacred. Continuity mattered more than compassion. Order mattered more than lives. And women who held influence, political, symbolic, dynastic, were not removed violently when they became inconvenient. They were neutralized, not erased publicly, managed privately. The Byzantines inherited Roman law, Christian doctrine, and an unmatched bureaucratic instinct. Every action required justification. Every punishment needed a record, but the records were careful. They spoke of retirement, of protection, of moral necessity. They avoided language that would invite scrutiny. What they did to powerful women was never described as cruelty. It was described as procedure.
This wasn't personal. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't revenge. It was policy. The empire understood something fundamental about power. Killing a woman with legitimacy created martyrs. Allowing her to live, contained, diminished, isolated, created obedience. It sent a message without creating a symbol. So the system adapted. Women who threatened succession, challenged doctrine, or disrupted alliances were not executed in the streets. They were redirected into lives that stripped them of voice, movement, and memory. Convents, palaces turned inward, residences without visitors.
Titles without authority. They remained alive, but outside history. This approach required patience. It required coordination between church officials, imperial advisors, legal scribes, and guards sworn to silence. It required an empire confident enough to wait. And Byzantium was nothing if not patient. What history records is the splendor of mosaics, the brilliance of theology, the endurance of empire. What wasn't written down, at least not plainly, was how many women vanished from influence with ever technically falling. Their absence was explained away as piety, or illness, or humility. Buried in the archives are phrases that repeat with unsettling calm. She withdrew. She was placed under protection. She chose a life of prayer. Choice in this system was often theoretical. Byzantine chroniclers were not ignorant. They knew what they were recording, but they also knew which details invited danger. So they learned to write around suffering instead of through it. And the empire rewarded that restraint. This method was perfected over centuries. It did not require cruelty to be visible. It required it to be effective.
Consider the position of an empress, a princess, or a regent in Byzantium. Power for women was always conditional. It flowed through bloodlines, marriages, and symbols. A woman could rule, but only so long as she remained useful, legitimate, predictable. The moment she became a variable, the system responded. Not with outrage, with paperwork. A decree could change everything. A synod could redefine morality. A confession, voluntary or coerced, could justify removal. The language was always clean. The outcome never was. And this is where the real severity begins.
Because removal from power did not mean freedom from expectation. These women were still watched, still evaluated, still used as leverage. Their existence mattered, just not their agency. They lived inside a controlled silence. You did not speak without permission. You did not receive visitors without approval. You did not leave. Days blended together, not in chaos, but in routine. Routine was the point. It wore down resistance without leaving marks. This was worse than death because it demanded endurance. The empire understood endurance as a resource. It could be extracted. To understand this fully, you must abandon the idea of punishment as spectacle. Byzantium did not need public suffering to enforce obedience. Its power was internalized, feared, assumed. Everyone knew what happened to women who stepped beyond their assigned boundaries, not because they saw it, because they didn't see them again. One of the most striking aspects of this system is how rarely it broke its own rules. There were procedures even for disappearance. Titles were reassigned. Estates were absorbed. Children were redirected into safer, more controllable paths.
Life went on. This normalization is what makes the system difficult to confront. There are no mass graves to point to, no dramatic collapse, just continuity. And continuity, when built on quiet suffering, becomes invisible. This is not a story of a single ruler's cruelty. It spans reigns, dynasties, doctrinal shifts. It survived iconoclasm and restoration. It adapted to changing theology without changing its core instinct, control through containment. What they didn't teach, what was never emphasized, was how many political crises were resolved not through war, but through the neutralization of women who embodied alternative futures. Wives who legitimized rivals, mothers who controlled heirs, daughters who symbolized alliances that no longer served. Their removal stabilized the empire, on paper. But stabilization came at a cost that never appeared in official accounts. The psychological toll was profound. Imagine knowing you are alive only because your silence serves someone else's order. Imagine being preserved as a symbol while being denied participation in the world you once shaped. That kind of survival reshapes identity. And this is where the cruelty becomes structural rather than personal. Because once the system exists, it no longer requires malice. Officials follow precedent. Clerics cite doctrine. Guards obey orders. No one feels responsible. That diffusion of responsibility is what allowed this practice to persist. And persist it did. If this kind of history matters, if examining how power survives by silencing rather than killing matters, then dark inquest history exists for this exact reason. Not to dramatize the past, but to sit with what was designed to be forgotten. The women subjected to this system were not weak. Many were intelligent, politically skilled, and deeply aware of the forces surrounding them. Some resisted openly, others adapted. Some disappeared into records so thin they feel intentional. Their stories survive not as narratives, but as gaps. A coronation followed by silence, a regency that ends without explanation, a name mentioned once, then never again. Those gaps are not accidents, they are evidence. And as we move closer to the individuals themselves, to their decisions, their waiting, their calculated endurance, the weight of this system becomes harder to ignore. Because what happened next was not the result of a single moment. It was the result of being left alive on purpose. You are still in Constantinople, but time has moved forward. The corridors remain the same. The marble still reflects authority. What has changed is your understanding. You now recognize that what you witnessed was not an exception. It was a pattern. Byzantium did not improvise when it came to powerful women. It consulted precedent. Every decision rested on earlier cases, earlier removals, earlier silences. The empire kept memory not to honor the past, but to replicate control. What worked once was refined, adjusted, and reused. This was governance through containment. To see it clearly, you must look at the machinery behind the throne. Not the emperor alone, but the council, the patriarch, the legal scholars, the court historians. Power in Byzantium was collective, and so was responsibility. That is why no single hand appears stained. A woman's fall from influence rarely appeared dramatic in the sources. Chroniclers avoided verbs that suggested force. Instead, they favored passive constructions. Events seemed to happen on their own. She was removed. She was relocated. She entered religious life. The language itself did the work of concealment. What wasn't written down mattered more than what was. Conversations held in private chambers, warnings delivered quietly, options presented as choices when they were, in truth, narrow corridors leading in one direction. The system relied on compliance produced through inevitability. Once a woman understood that resistance would not bring release, only prolongation, many complied outwardly. That compliance was then recorded as consent, and consent, once recorded, erased the need for justification. This was not accidental. Byzantine law was deeply invested in appearances. Legitimacy was everything. A ruler without legitimacy invited rebellion. A punishment without legitimacy invited dissent. So the empire learned to punish without appearing to punish. Consider the role of religious institutions. Monasteries and convents were central to this process, not as places of sanctuary, but as tools of political resolution. They offered the perfect solution: removal without bloodshed, silence framed as virtue, isolation disguised as devotion. A woman sent to religious life did not vanish violently. She simply stopped participating. Her lands could be redistributed. Her alliances dissolved, her claims rendered irrelevant. And because she lived, there was no martyrdom to rally around. From the outside, it looked merciful. From the inside, it was absolute. The daily reality of this imposed withdrawal is rarely described, but its outline is clear. Restricted movement, controlled correspondence, supervision justified as spiritual guidance, a life reduced to routine and obedience. This was not meant to be temporary, and yet the empire avoided finality. Death ends a problem. Survival prolongs control. As long as a woman lived, her existence could be managed. Her presence could be invoked or ignored as needed. She became a contingency. This approach reveals a deep understanding of political psychology. Byzantium knew that fear was more effective when it was quiet, when it was learned rather than displayed. Women at court did not need to see cruelty to fear it. They only needed to see absence.
A seat once occupied, now empty. A voice once heard, now missing. A name no longer spoken. That absence shaped behavior far more effectively than any public punishment. And it shaped memory. Over time, this system trained historians as well.
Chroniclers learned which stories were safe to tell and which required careful handling. Women who disappeared into controlled lives were often remembered only for their beginnings, not their ends. A promising marriage, a brief regency, a moment of influence, then silence. This silence was not a failure of record-keeping. Byzantium kept records obsessively. It was a choice. What history records, it records confidently. What it omits completely. And so, centuries later, we are left with outlines rather than portraits. We know these women existed.
We know they mattered. We know something ended abruptly, but we are rarely told how they lived afterward. This is where the human cost becomes harder to dismiss. Imagine the psychological weight of being preserved as a problem rather than eliminated as an enemy. You are kept alive not because you are valued, but because your survival serves someone else's stability. Every day becomes a reminder of what was taken, not violently, but thoroughly. You wake knowing that nothing you say will reach beyond your walls, that your thoughts are irrelevant to the world you once influenced.
That history will continue without consulting you. This kind of endurance does not produce rebellion. It produces resignation. And resignation, when institutionalized, becomes invisible. The empire counted on this invisibility. It allowed Byzantium to claim moral superiority over more openly violent regimes. It allowed rulers to present themselves as merciful, restrained, civilized. And it worked. Foreign observers admired Byzantium's sophistication. The empire appeared orderly, lawful, guided by reason and faith. Its internal methods rarely drew criticism because they rarely drew attention.
What wasn't written down stayed buried, but occasionally fragments surface. A letter that hints at despair without stating it. A hagiography that praises obedience too insistently. A legal decree that explains too much. These fragments suggest lives lived under conditions no person should endure, yet endured nonetheless. Not because the women accepted their fate willingly, but because resistance had been designed out of the system. This is the difference between chaos and organization. Chaos produces stories. Organization produces silence. Byzantium chose silence. And that silence extended beyond the women themselves. Families learned not to ask questions. Allies learned not to protest. Children learned which names were safe to remember and which were not. Memory became selective. This selectivity shaped Byzantine culture profoundly. It taught society that stability required sacrifice, but that sacrifice should never be discussed openly. It normalized the idea that some lives could be reduced quietly for the greater good. And because it was quiet, it felt inevitable. What they don't teach is how deeply this inevitability was manufactured.
How many meetings, documents, and negotiations went into creating outcomes that appeared natural. A woman did not simply withdraw, she was withdrawn. The system ensured that once the process began, reversal was nearly impossible. Appeals disappeared into councils. Supporters were reassigned. The woman herself was isolated from information that might inspire hope. Hope, after all, was dangerous. The climax of these stories rarely involved a dramatic moment. No single act defined the end. Instead, there was a gradual closing of doors. Access narrowed.
Influence faded.
Identity eroded, and when the world finally moved on, it did so without acknowledging what it had consumed. This is why the Byzantine method was worse than death. Death ends a story. This method erased it while keeping the subject alive. And yet, despite everything, traces remain. Not erased by time, but by design. Still detectable if you know where to look. As we move closer to specific women, to names that once carried weight within the empire, the cost of this system becomes personal. Not through suffering described, but through endurance implied. Through waiting.
Through silence. Through lives lived entirely out of sight. You are no longer looking at the system from a distance. Now you are inside it, standing close enough to feel its pressure. The machinery that once seemed abstract narrows its focus. Names begin to surface, not fully illuminated, but no longer hidden entirely. One of them is Irene of Athens. History remembers her as an empress who ruled in her own right, a woman who navigated court politics with precision, a regent who understood power well enough to hold it longer than expected. What history records less clearly is how the empire handled her once she ceased to be useful.
Irene's authority was unprecedented, but it was also conditional. She ruled because the system allowed it, until it no longer did. When her position became unstable, the response was not explosive, it was administrative. She was removed quietly, relocated, isolated. The sources do not dwell on her final years. They mention her presence, but not her influence. They acknowledge her survival, but not her condition. What mattered to the empire was that she no longer shaped outcomes. Her continued existence posed no threat once her voice was contained. This pattern repeats.
Consider women born into dynasties whose marriages were meant to stabilize alliances. Their value was symbolic before it was personal. When the symbol failed, the woman did not cease to exist, but she ceased to matter politically. The empire treated them like unresolved equations, not destroyed, just set aside. Many were placed into religious institutions, not because they sought devotion, but because devotion was the only socially acceptable justification for removal. The narrative protected the empire's image while ensuring compliance, and compliance was enforced not through chains, but through structure.
Daily life in enforced withdrawal was not chaotic. It was rigid, predictable, carefully regulated. Meals at fixed times, prayer at fixed hours, interaction monitored under the guise of spiritual discipline. This was not a retreat, it was a holding pattern. What made this particularly effective was the absence of overt brutality. There was no single moment to point to as injustice, no spectacle to provoke outrage, just a life gradually narrowed until nothing remained but routine. This narrowing was deliberate, because a woman stripped of unpredictability could not inspire unrest.
She could not rally supporters. She could not rewrite her own story. She became an object of administration. Another figure emerges from the shadows of the record, Anna Dalaseni, a powerful matriarch whose influence shaped emperors. While she died with honor, her story illustrates the boundaries placed around female authority. Even when respected, women's power was tolerated only within carefully defined limits. Those who crossed those limits were not corrected publicly. They were absorbed privately. This absorption had lasting psychological effects, not only on the women themselves, but on those who watched.
Court life became an exercise in restraint. Women learned to measure their speech, their alliances, their visibility. Influence had to be subtle. Too visible, and it invited correction. too effective, and it invited removal. The lesson was internalized across generations. Silence became a survival strategy. And silence, when practiced long enough, reshapes culture. Byzantine society began to treat the disappearance of women from power as natural, expected, unremarkable. The absence no longer raised questions because the system had trained people not to ask them.
What wasn't written down became irrelevant, and yet traces of resistance remain, not in action, but in endurance. Some women complied outwardly while maintaining inner autonomy. Others left behind coded language in letters or religious writings, subtle expressions of loss, of waiting, of resignation that was not acceptance. These fragments matter because they reveal what the official narrative avoided. They show that survival was not peace. The climax of many of these lives did not come with a decisive event. It came with realization. The realization that there would be no reversal.
No return to influence. No acknowledgement of what was taken. Doors closed quietly. Visitors stopped arriving. Correspondence slowed, then ceased. And the woman understood that she would outlive her relevance. This moment, the acceptance of permanent erasure, is the darkest point of the story. Not because of violence, but because of finality. Finality without death. It is here that the system reveals its true nature. It was not designed to punish, it was designed to continue. By keeping these women alive, the empire avoided reckoning. It avoided having to justify endings.
It avoided confronting the moral weight of its decisions. Instead, it allowed time to do the work. Time blurred memory. Time softened outrage. Time transformed injustice into tradition. The aftermath of this system extended far beyond individual lives. Politically, it reinforced centralized control. Rivals were neutralized without destabilizing succession. Crises were resolved quietly. Authority appeared unbroken. Culturally, it reshaped expectations. Female power became something to be feared, even by those who held it. Ambition had to be disguised as obedience.
Influence had to operate indirectly. Historically, it distorted the record. Women who shaped events disappeared from narratives once their usefulness ended. Their earlier contributions remained, but their conclusions were omitted. History preserved their rise, not their removal. This selective memory allowed Byzantium to present itself as orderly and just, even as it absorbed lives into silence. The system survived because it did not draw attention to itself. And that is its most enduring legacy. Not a single atrocity, but a method that taught power how to erase without killing.
As the empire declined, the practice did not vanish immediately. It lingered in attitudes, in institutions, in assumptions about authority and gender. Even after Byzantium fell, its approach to control influenced those who inherited its structures. This is why these stories matter, not because they shock, but because they explain. They explain how endurance can be mistaken for consent, how survival can be mistaken for mercy, how silence can be mistaken for peace. The women who lived through this were not passive, they were constrained. Their compliance was extracted, not offered.
And their endurance deserves to be remembered, not as acceptance, but as evidence. Evidence of a system that understood power deeply enough to hide its costs. You are now standing at the far edge of the story, where the records thin and the voices fade. What remains is not resolution, but residue. The kind history leaves behind when it chooses continuity over truth. By the time the Byzantine Empire declined, the system that contained powerful women had already done its work. It did not collapse with the walls of Constantinople. It did not end with a decree.
It simply stopped being visible, because systems like this do not announce themselves, they dissolve into habit. What history records after these women disappear is stability, smooth transitions, legitimate successions, official harmony between throne and church. The absence of scandal becomes proof of order. What wasn't written down is the cost of that order. The women who lived under enforced withdrawal left behind no rebellions, no manifestos, no public accusations. They left behind silence. And silence, when inherited, shapes how future generations understand the past.
Later historians inherited documents already filtered by the system. They repeated phrases without interrogating them. She retired. She withdrew. She devoted herself to faith. These explanations became tradition. Tradition hardened into fact, and fact replaced inquiry. This is how erasure completes itself, not through destruction, but through repetition. Culturally, Byzantium's approach reshaped the meaning of female power. Authority held by women was framed as temporary by default, acceptable only under specific conditions, revocable at any moment without explanation.
This lesson outlived the empire. It taught societies that removal without violence was not only possible, but preferable. That suffering hidden behind ritual did not count as injustice. That a life could be dismantled quietly and still be called mercy. The women at the center of this story were not forgotten by accident. They were set aside by design. What survives of them survives unevenly. A name in a chronicle, a title without context, a reign without an ending. Their final years remain unexamined, not because they were unimportant, but because examining them would expose the machinery beneath Byzantine order.
And that machinery implicates more than emperors. It implicates advisors who drafted decrees, clerics who framed confinement as virtue, scribes who chose which details to omit, courtiers who learned to look away. This is why the horror of this history does not come from chaos, it comes from organization, from a system so confident in its legitimacy that it did not need to explain itself. The women who endured this were not meant to be remembered as victims. They were meant to disappear as problems already solved. Their survival was not a mercy, it was a function.
And yet, by surviving, they leave behind something the system did not anticipate: unease. Because once you recognize the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. The gaps in the record begin to speak. The silences begin to weigh more than the events themselves. You realize that what looks like calm continuity was built on lives narrowed until only obedience remained. That death would have ended suffering, but survival required living inside what followed. This is where the story must end, not with justice restored, not with wrongs corrected, but with recognition.
Recognition that power does not always need violence to be absolute. Recognition that endurance is often mistaken for acceptance. Recognition that silence can be manufactured. The Byzantine Empire mastered that manufacture, and the women who lived within it paid the price, not in a moment, but across lifetimes. If these stories matter, if remembering those who were not erased by time, but by design matters, then subscribing to Dark Inquest history is not a gesture of support. It is a refusal to let this silence complete itself. Their lives were managed to be forgotten. Remembering them is the only disruption that remains.